Good afternoon. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program, The Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China. We have Dr. Jonathan Ward, founder of the Atlas Organization. He's an author of the book, The Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China. And our moderator today is Jack Devine. He is president of the Arkin Group. He's also an author and formerly was director of the worldwide operations of the CIA. He was instrumental in leading the program to get Russia out of Afghanistan. Gentlemen, if you'd like to come on screen, I'll welcome you and turn it over to you. I know our audience knows to submit some questions into the chat section, so we can ask questions in about 35 minutes. Take it away. I know it's going to be a great program.
Kim, thank you for that. It's a great opportunity here. I hope people realize just how lucky they are that we have a genuine China expert. I'm just so tired of pundits on TV that read a book and now they're China experts or ex-agency people or government people that have one assignment. You're looking at somebody who's really steeped in China, in the history of it, in the language of it, and has written two great books. And today we're going to talk about The Decisive Decade. But I want to reminisce because Jonathan wasn't always as old as he is today. And I remember we were in New York City, Jonathan, you came to see me for advice. Why you came to see me still remains a mystery. But you told me you were going to go to China and you were going to live with the people on the ground, eat rice where they ate rice, and drive a truck. And I thought, wow, now this is somebody that if he does this, it's going to put him in a unique area. But he's a gifted linguist. He and I will have a little debate in Chinese later on, but he also speaks Russian, Spanish, Arabic. I don't know what you ever did, John. You must have been in school all the time learning. But Jonathan is the real thing. He's addressed these issues. He's recognized everywhere. And I think this is a real treat. We've done some things together. I usually address Russia, and then we go back and forth about the Russian and China. We don't agree on everything, and I think that makes it for an interesting exchange. But this is a big subject today, China. And Jonathan, I think it might be worthwhile before we get into the decisive decade, if you just talk about that experience in China, and later on going through their archives and how that influenced you and your thinking about China. So let me turn it over to you to just take us back in time and so the audience really understands where you're coming from in terms of the credibility that you bring to the table.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you to the LA World Affairs Council. This is the first official virtual event of my book tour. The Decisive Decade came out yesterday, and next to me also is China's Vision of Victory, which I wrote in 2019, which explained the global strategy of the Chinese Communist Party. So the Decisive Decade is the US response. I mean, what I think we need to do in order to address the genuine strategic foundations of the CCP, worldview and sort of global operations and what we're going to do about that. But, Jack, thanks for returning me in a sense to where this all began, which was as a teenager. I grew up learning languages. I learned French and Spanish and Latin growing up. And then by the time I got to college, realized you could study any language you wanted to, and was making the decision between Russian, Chinese, and Arabic, and eventually wound up doing all three. But the bottom line was I wanted to basically learn the most widely spoken languages in the world and utilize that as a basis for understanding what was happening in the world in my lifetime and in the 21st century and all that. That was sort of my idea as a 17, 18-year-old. And the first thing, of course, got into the study of different languages. But, China was sort of beckoning in that sense when it comes to, if you're going to go make an exploration of the modern world, you better go and have a look at the People's Republic of China. So I had read Marco Polo as a child and was always interested in that, and wound up spending my first year out of college where I'd done Russian and Chinese language at Columbia, spent the following year backpacking around the People's Republic of China, traveling in truck caravans around Tibet and Xinjiang, having a motorcycle out in the Xinjiang deserts, doing, what Jack has just described here. If the intention was to go and live and travel with regular people, to get outside of the major cities, to go and spend immersion time in the countryside, to crisscross the whole country. I wound up riding a bicycle across southern China, and ultimately it went all the way down to Eastern Indonesian archipelago, and it became sort of a long-term walkabout where I got to immerse in many countries and in very unconventional ways. So that was the beginning, in a sense, of my investigation of an exploration of what modern China was really about. Later, several years later, I wound up living around the world for 5 solid years on the back of that, but then went and did a PhD at Oxford, where I was initially admitted for Russia-China relations because I had the background in both languages, but wound up switching into China-India relations. I'd spent a little time in India, in my teenage and early 20s years, and then had access. I mean, basically the communists had opened the archives, all of their diplomatic archives in Beijing that explained the first 20 years of diplomatic history from the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 up to the late 1960s, and they closed them all down there. So they were all taken down, while I was there, incidentally. And I don't think that had anything to do with my own research, but I was investigating the rise and fall of the China-India relationship. And in doing that, gained sort of a broader perspective on the foundations of Communist Party thinking. It's sort of global diplomatic strategy at that in that era, which I think a lot of that remains, the most important foundations here when we look at Xi Jinping, and we'll talk about that today, realizing that he's just one of the heirs to this long-term vision of the CCP, and that's what we're fundamentally dealing with today in U.S. strategy and diplomacy. I mean, we're going to have to reorient everything around this essential question. But between the archival access, between the multiple years of traveling in an immersion sort of capacity with the language, getting way outside of the major cities and living with regular people, I had a pretty interesting time there. I got to see, I think, on one hand, some of the bright sides and positive aspects of it. I mean, it was a very interesting and wonderful country to travel in, and at the same time, some of the real dangers that I think were clear to me at that time in ways that have become clearer now to many more Americans. For instance, spending several months in Xinjiang and Tibet, I got to see, really the dark side of the CCP, and just, you get familiar with military checkposts and the Wujing and military police, and just the lockdown, that the real occupation of those areas and the way the party is exerting its control. And then later wound up with a PhD in the sort of Himalayan border regions. So I had traveled by truck through parts of China where China and India had fought a war, and I didn't even know about it at that time. I mean, that was something that later. So there was a lot of different experiences coming together. But I think the early years of travel were very important to seeing what was going on in the world, and seeing another side to the story that becomes perhaps the most important side.
I don't have the comment, Jonathan. I mean, that's just a great story. It's that put in context, who you are and why you have a right to speak out. I guess everyone has a right to speak out in our blessed country, but you're the real thing. So one of the things that I wanted to hit today, and I'm coming to this, getting my pen ready for another article. I'm going to close in on you on China. And that is, so much is said about China and our policymakers and people down on the Hill. But what's really interesting, I'm a product of the Cold War, which now has been restarted, and I'm back in, I got my cape out of the closet. So, but it's a communist country. No one, you can hardly get it out, like communism. What does that mean? Oh, that they just use that as a ploy. They're really just businessmen and autocrats, and they're taking care of their class. And I'm heading towards a different point of view here, which I think will probably coincide with you. And I think we're missing the point. I think a lot of people don't understand how important that ideology is. And you might want to point out why it's different than the Cold War ideology, but it is an ideology. And the second part of it, and I'll come back with the specific question, is, we better understand Xi in the context of that. So, you're talking about your archival research, but, you've been working on it ever since, right? And I don't know who I'd pick the phone up and call if I wanted to find somebody that really understood the inner workings of the Communist Party. But I think it plays into where this is all going in the end. There has to be a change in that political dynamic. But Jonathan, can you educate us? And I'm speaking of myself in that group as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role of the party and what it really means and why we might be missing the boat by not giving it enough attention.
Absolutely, Jack. I mean, and there are a few different parts to that question. I remember when I first showed up at Oxford, and I had the honor of studying with one of the best historians of China, of modern China, Professor Rana Mitter. And when I was going through my sort of China studies, China history, 201 phase, let's say, I asked him, what's this all about? I mean, communist China. I mean, everybody thinks that's not true. And he said, don't forget, this is about Leninism. It's a Leninist party. And what he meant by that, I believe, was that it's an authoritarian system that relies on control. Its vision of politics is about control. And it's really a different relationship between the citizen and state. This is me now extrapolating from what my supervisor once said, but it's a totally and utterly different vision of citizen and state than we have in a free democracy or in the United States or elsewhere in the free world. And in that sense, the foundations of the CCP have not changed from the early years when they believed, Mao believed that Marxist-Leninism was the right vehicle to bring about what he cared about, which was the rise of China and the return to China, the return of China to major power status. Mao was essentially a nationalist who adopted the Marxist-Leninist ideology. And today's party, of course, has not let go of authoritarianism or even totalitarianism. I mean, that's come back in some ways that probably Mao and Stalin couldn't have even imagined. I mean, you look at the techno-totalitarian state and all of its sort of capabilities. And some of this was envisioned by different party leaders over the decades, but I think only now are we seeing a capability that's, I think tracks through technology, some of the real, authoritarian imagination and sort of desires. So we're dealing with that. We're dealing with something that has a lot of continuity here. But I think remembering that this is all about for today's Communist Party, what they call the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And China's Vision of Victory, my first book, is about, and the subject of this is the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. What does that really mean? What does it mean for the world? What does it mean for China? And the fact that, Communist Party leaders today have basically seen themselves in a continuum where they're heirs to Mao Zedong's new China. That's what Mao called it, the new China. And his whole philosophy was that China had stood up, it was going to assert itself. It's why you had the Sino-Soviet split. I mean, he was not willing to be a junior partner in a broader sort of communist vision of the world. I mean, he also wanted to achieve a return to major power status for China itself. And then from the new China to what's now called the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And even Mao himself believed that he was an heir to Sun Yat-sen, who was, of course, a nationalist revolutionary looking to basically improve and modernize China, sort of pull it away from its what had happened in the late Qing dynasty and the sort of decline of China and set it on a path for modernization and major power status. So the party sees itself as doing that, but they also have, I think, very specific Leninist properties. I mean, the vision of domestic control, the sort of, nature of the party apparatus. I mean, all of this was, a lot of this was, brought to them from the Soviet Union during the sort of collaboration of those two parties in the broader Cold War ahead of the Sino-Soviet split. And then today, when we take Xi Jinping, I mean, one of the important parts of my first book was to show us, because I think we, generally speaking, a lot of the world, both in the policy community, but also much more broadly, just people who are interested in and engaged in international affairs, look at this as Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping as the ruler of China who is basically brought it away from the opening up and engagement of the world and set it on a path for confrontation with the United States and the West. And as a historian of the first 20 years of the People's Republic of China, I mean, that's my academic training, I wasn't surprised by Xi Jinping. It was just, hey, look, he's going back to what they initially envisioned. So Xi himself, I think he sees himself as part of this continuum. He's part of a historical lineage. The way I described it in the first book is if there were a Mount Rushmore of the Chinese Communist Party, it would have Sun Yat-sen, it would have Mao Zedong, and it would have Deng Xiaoping, who made China rich, and then it would have Xi Jinping, who seeks to convert China's economic power into military power and to demonstrate that this is, that they're on a path to being a global superpower. And what's even deeper than that, and I think in many ways more important, is the vision of the party's vision for the role of the People's Republic of China in international affairs is not to be co-equal with other powers or co-equal with other superpowers. It's to be the dominant piece of an international structure. And they call that the community of common destiny for mankind. And it makes it pretty clear that they see themselves as the centerpiece of global affairs. And that's when you get into, elements of, I mean, if we want to talk about the relationship between the party and, earlier visions of power in China, I mean, there's a longer lineage there even that I think matters. So for the US, I think the bottom line is to understand the geopolitics of the 21st century, certainly the decade ahead and beyond. One is what does China want? I.e., what does the Communist Party of China, which is going to be in power for the foreseeable future, what does that want? And then the fact that the United States and the free world should not and cannot accept that as an outcome. I mean, this is not an outcome any more than the Soviet Union's dominance of the world or the Axis powers of the 1930s. To have the Moscow-Beijing axis become the sort of prevailing force in human affairs would be a disaster. So we're going to have to formulate a counterpoint, and we're going to have to turn this into a contest that we can win. And ideally, it will be a contest that we win peacefully. I think a lot of it will be based on economics. But the best analogy is really the first Cold War, and also for the reason that the same two states, Russia and China, are back now. As authoritarian contenders for power.
So if I mean, again, Jonathan, this is just a tease. I mean, anyone listening knows that they can spend hours with you over a cup of tea, dissecting the party. But I mean, I think that was really excellent sort of opening volley on it. In a cult of personality, I just wanted, as I said earlier, it's a mistake to think of Xi not being a party person. I mean, often people ask me what makes Putin tick, and I think that's a key question. You're talking about Russia, right? What are the motivators? Who is he? And I haven't seen as much written about Xi, the personality, and it's his relationship with the party and its ideology. I wonder, because I think it's key to understanding. I think he's getting stronger and stronger each passing day, and fitting more of your Leninist approach to authoritarian control. But can you give us and I know you're not a psychiatrist, at least a certified
Far
one.
from it.
Well, I pretend to be one when I diagnose some of these people, but I find I get them wrong too often to be certified. But on Xi, why don't you talk about him in the context of not any particular foreign policy, but him as a person and the party?
Well, my sense of that, and that's right, I'm definitely not a psychologist, and if I had to write a psychological profile, and I'm sure it wouldn't be a perfect one here by any measure, but my sense of Xi is that he's a man of enormous ambition, and he has found himself at the head of a country that has made enormous strides over pretty much a single generation, maybe two, to returning to essentially arriving at superpower status. And I think he's also somebody who believes in the ideologies of the rise of China. I mean, and the other piece of the Marxist-Leninist piece sort of situation is it's really that this idea of restoring China, of what's been called, certainly by the party, the Bainian Guochi, the 100 years of national humiliation, that went from the Opium Wars to the founding of the People's Republic of China. That in a sense is the guiding ideology here, is that the country is going to rise, they're going to facilitate that rise, and they're going to return, in a sense, to a world with China at the center. So it's not a novel thing to them, it's a mission, and they call it a mission about returning China to global preeminence. And obviously this was, China's preeminence was never truly global in the sense that, global history in those 300 years ago was not one that it's not the same as today. I mean, today, for them to do this, it's going to happen in a global economic system, in a world where military power is far sort of more contested, where the oceans that separate America from other continents are, I think, far smaller when it comes to real military technology and all of that. So they're undertaking a vision that is nothing short of trying to transform the world. And I think Xi Jinping sees himself as the person who is going to if not complete that, at least complete the hardest part, perhaps. And that's what I think is truly dangerous about him. I mean, he's a man who has sort of Maoist ambition, but he's inherited a system that is basically functional when it comes to economic power, military power, and global influence. That's not what Mao had. Mao didn't have any of that. You know, Mao talked about surpassing the United States just based on population side, but of course, he was, you know, hamstrung by real communist orthodoxies and by the fact that China was an agrarian nation at the time. I mean, Xi Jinping has inherited an accelerated superpower, which at the end of the day, let's not forget, it was the United States that really built, you know, the China of the last 30 years. It was access to our markets, our technology, and our capital that brought them from being essentially an 80% agrarian nation in the 1980s to a technological superpower. So I think Xi Jinping has many blind spots, particularly the view of the United States that exists in the party, the belief that America is in decline and China is rising, which I also think is sort of a Marxist-Leninist thing. I mean, at the end of the day, the communists believed there was an endpoint to history where communism would win. I think the Chinese Communist Party believes there's an endpoint to history where China wins. So that's what we're dealing with.
Then I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I want to make
sorry.
sure I get to your book, right? But before we do, just one quick thing, right? And then I think it's contained in the book more explicitly. But I remembered when your first book came out, China's Vision of Victory, and the Financial Times pointed out that you were the most explicit person in putting forth the concept of, again, a containment strategy and how your views might have been different than Graham Allison or Michael Pillsbury or Henry Kissinger for that matter. Again, I'm trying to watch the clock. So do me a favor. In 6 words, can you sum it up? No, but let's move crisply because I want to get to your book and maybe the 4 themes there very quick. Okay. But I think it's important because it's central to your thinking.
Absolutely. And the Decisive Decade it's about containment. It's about economic containment. It's about creating a US and allied global grand strategy that actually can deal with and really dismantle the Chinese Communist Party's real strategies. And for that to succeed, we have to focus on, I think, a battle for the global economy, a restructuring of the world economy that keeps America and the allies in the preeminent position and allows us to, you know, maintain military superiority over the Moscow-Beijing axis. And we're going to have to do that through economic power. And the party, for all of its, you know, sort of, I mean, the news cycle will tell you something new every couple of weeks about demographics or just, you know, the housing market or this and that. But at the end of the day, they have a very clear economic strategy. And that's the one that we have to focus on dismantling in order to maintain the military power that can create deterrence. So we have to get military strategy and economic strategy right. Yes. And also, as you know, I'm a historian of modern Asia, you know, at least from my academic training of India and China. And the United States is, you know, I'm learning anew, I mean, just sort of our strategic history. And, you know, I've been fortunate to have some great mentors there. But the bottom line, I mean, containment was a really ingenious strategy. I mean, it was one that I think we forget how utterly successful it was, that we were able to peacefully you know, prevail over the Soviet Union through a 50-year global strategy that we passed from administration to administration and ultimately succeeded in winning the Cold War. I mean, that was an act of American genius. And I think there's a different version of it today.
But I think this is a good segue into this great book, The Decisive Decade, because the way you've structured your book, which I think is very well done, you identify 4 areas that you think are necessary for policymakers to be paying attention. And number 1, you started, and you've already laid it out in the containment theory, talking about the economic, the importance of the economic game. So why don't we, you know, again, we have to watch the time if we're going to, I have to get to Taiwan, I want to get to Russia and India. So, and I can talk fast when we have to, but if you could, again, on the book itself, these principal concept, the economic one being the foremost. If I want to set the book in its right context, and then maybe a question on Russia, India. I was going to do the Belt and Road, but I think I want to do Taiwan, and I think we're going to be pressed to get all of those in. But I think the thesis of your book and the centerpiece around these 4 things, if you could tackle that, I think that would, whet the appetite of people to go out and read more profoundly your thoughts.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jack. And that's right. So I set the book up into the 4 arenas of classical grand strategy. And I began with a Theodore Roosevelt quote about the man in the arena, because I think at the end of the day, this is a contest that we must engage with this contest. I mean, America's role, in my view, is to be the place that can solve the hard geopolitical problems. I mean, that's a role we've played for 100 years, and I think we can't step away from that today. I mean, the consequences are far too great. So, so for America to win this contest, and I do believe it's a contest that is about winning. We have to prevail and defeat the Communist Party's strategies. I mean, they have a series of strategies that allow them to slowly and gradually, but very firmly, ascend into a dominant position into the Indo-Pacific and eventually beyond. So the 4 arenas that we have to look at are economic, military, diplomatic, and then ideas. And this is absolutely this is about ideas. I mean, there are plenty of people that say it's not an ideological contest, but we didn't get to talk about Wang Huning yet, who's I think the most interesting member of the Politburo other than Xi Jinping. I mean, the real ideologist that sort of theorizes China's rise and its different strategies. I mean, we're up against something that's full spectrum. So we're going to have to win the economic game. I mean, that involves how do we remain the world's largest economy, the world's most sort of sophisticated economy, and one with totally global reach. So to make sure that we and the alliance system, which are still the vast majority of global GDP and global wealth, how do we ensure that that's a community that sets the standards for innovation, for strategic industries, and for revolutions in military affairs? I mean, we have to work together as an alliance system. We're about to hit this moment in economic history called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is about the digitization of industries, the Internet of Things. I mean, that's going to be a massive productivity and connectivity boost. So that could add 10 trillion to our GDP if we get it right. But the longer that we remain interconnected with China, our gains become their gains too. And that's one of the key points here is we are going to have to go through some level of decoupling, not necessarily across the board, but across the things, the industries and technologies that give us a genuine advantage. We can't have our innovations become our adversaries.
I think that's a good point to cap that off. There's no way we're going to be able to go profoundly. I'm going to drop, and I hope the audience takes notes on this. Let's ask Jonathan about India, the Belt and Road, and also, the grand strategy in terms of Africa, Latin America, Global South. But I want to try and use the next 5 minutes on 2 subjects. The last one will be Taiwan and what's going to be the confrontation. But before that, you and I have over the years talked about Russia and China and how important that relationship. Now, we disagree on several points, but the one that I think are really in sync on is we have to break that relationship if we can. That should be part of our strategy. And as you know, I had an op-ed just a week and a half ago in which I basically was saying, it's important that we concentrate on Ukraine, but we have to understand that the bigger objective is that we really need to defeat Putin, get him out. And it's part of the bigger strategy as it ties to China. And I've been on that, for over a year, pushing just how important it is to have that change. And I went into it in, my book was published on Spy Master's Prism and about the Russians, and we needed to pay more attention back in 2020. You feel a little bit like I might have felt then, is paying more attention to certain aspects of Russia. And Putin today in his invasion of Ukraine has really changed so many chess pieces on the board, including China. So I think it'd be worthwhile for you to say what you think. I mean, my view is with a Russia that is less bellicose and feeling more in need of having cooperation, that doesn't mean they're going to be democratic or going to be an ally in NATO. But how important it is, because it's one of the biggest ways to tame growing aggression in China. And that's my personal view. But I'd like to hear how you see the China-Russia relationship and how solid is it and so on.
Right. Yeah. This is a question that Jack and I, have literally spent hours on in our World Affairs Councils and other speaking. And I mean, Spy Master's Prism, I think is a very uniquely insightful book into how Russian sort of strategy works at a level of disruption and all kinds of, important aggressive activities that we have to deal with. So, I mean, I think here that we've been through a Sino-Soviet split before. My doctorate at Oxford was initially supposed to be on the role of nationalism in the Sino-Soviet split, which, I think that's an important thing, because at the end of the day, these are two nationalist powers basically seeking to reconstruct their sort of long lost empires and positions in the world. And in that sense, they're like-minded. On the other hand, they I think are going to have some the tension has always been produced, certainly in the first Sino-Soviet split, by Beijing's, at that time, unwillingness to play the role of junior partner. And I think there's going to be a similar thing ultimately for Russia. I mean, for Russia to really become essentially a vassal state of the People's Republic of China, and energy and resource satrapy, where, unfortunately, I think it's sort of a perfect economic relationship where, China needs energy and agriculture, and Russia sells energy and agriculture. China needs certain kinds of advanced technologies. They can't beat us on aerospace engines or submarines or any of that, but Russia's pretty good at both. So it's a very, I think, frightening sort of economic relationship, if it ever, and it's one that would dramatically favor the People's Republic of China. I mean, 10 times the size of the Russian GDP. But we're going to have to try, this relationship, I think, can be split. I don't think that's a near-term issue. I think that's a sort of a 10-year thing, and that may be a decade thing. I mean, there has to be a post-Putin Russia eventually. And what Russia has done is it's foreclosed its relations with the West. And that's just I think Putin, people used to call him a great strategist. I remember when I was learning Russian and people would talk about Putin as a great strategist. I mean, this is terrible. I mean, the man destroyed his relations with Europe and America for the sake of what? To become a satrapy of the People's Republic of China. I mean, eventually the Russian people, I think, will not accept that, if not the regime. But the thing we have to do, I mean, there's an action item to this, and I think we have to go after the economic pieces that are actually bringing this relationship together. There are many, many Chinese companies, there are Chinese banks that are cementing the economic relationship. I mean, China's essentially providing the economic resources for Putin's war in Ukraine, no matter what they say to the world diplomatically. So I think we should be unafraid to target those banks and companies that are cementing the Russia-China relationship. If you break the seams, the split becomes easier in the long run.
Remember, Taiwan's around the corner. So
right.
Look, we're not far apart at all. I mean, in fact, one thing I would say is in my book, Spy Master's Prism, I said that he was good tactically, but terrible strategically. The paperback's coming out, and I want to revise it and say he's not even good tactically after what we've seen in Ukraine. But I think what you're saying, and I would agree with, is this is a marriage of convenience. It's more fragile than people think. And I remember in the period when I was running the program to drive the Russians out of China, I had to buy Soviet-style weapons. So we bought them in Egypt and China. Now, this is all in the public record, so I'm not going to be arrested by CIA when I say this.
It's in the movies,
so I went out and personally negotiated.
Yeah.
And we were settling on, it was like AK-47s, and I was looking for a price of $165. It may be off by $1 or $2, but we negotiated back and forth in good Chinese style, very professionally done. And at the end, they said, we're going to give it to you for $160. And I thought, wow, what kind of negotiation is this? Am I really getting good at this? And they said, no, we're giving it to you because you're fighting the Russians. And that was, when both countries were communist. Okay, so there's not a lot of love when you scratch below the surface, but it's a marriage of convenience. But here's the winner. Okay, this is your last question, right? You can't go anywhere where someone's not going to ask you about Taiwan and war, and people are very concerned about it. I've got my views on it, and you have yours. But today, and we have 1 minute left. But I would bet Kim would let us go for a couple of minutes if you could tackle the Taiwan situation and how you think China looks at it, and in a very serious way. The audience will want to know, what do you think the odds are that in the next year or two we're going to see a confrontation? I said I have my views, and we can have one of those debates, but I think this is your hour. Let's hear your views.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, I think a Taiwan invasion is preventable. I mean, the US and our allies have a vote in that. If we are absolutely laser focused on deterrence, on building the right deterrent posture in the Pacific and on messaging appropriately, and on doing the right elements of containment that start to, influence the economic side of that. We have to be coordinated and able to do, alliance system level sanctions on China. I think we still, it's still preventable. However, it's something that if we don't prevent it, I think it happens eventually. And my concern would be that if there's going to be a move on Taiwan, I think China, probably wants to do that while Putin is in power and while Putin is engaged in the field in Europe. I mean, much easier to have a two-theater issue for the US and our allies. And what really unites Russia and China here, is the anti-Americanism. And I think we deeply underestimate the anti-Americanism in Beijing and in the Chinese Communist Party. And I think we've been very foolish to allow our business interests to convince us that we have no issue with the People's Republic of China. And that's a lot of what the new book is.
What a great point to wrap it up on. I think that should stimulate a lot of firepower in your direction. But that was an excellent, in a short time, you've really covered so many themes in a profound way. But Kim, I think it's time to let the audience have a shot at Jonathan. Okay, in fairness, because we could go on, as we said, there's so many things we could tease out because we sound like we're more in agreement than we may be on a few issues, but nuanced more than anything else. So, Rachel, are you managing this show? Because I think I brought us in on time.
Yeah, perfectly on time. And thank you both so much for being here today and for such a great conversation. And thank you also to our audience for the questions you've submitted. So I wanted to start with two that are fairly similar. One of them is a bit longer, but I'll read them both at the same time. So the first is the desirable goal for the US, in your opinion, to balance China as an equal power or to limit China to a subordinate power to the US in the West? And then the second question, what do you think about changing the attitude with China not to be a game of winner and loser, but one that has a mutual/international goal of how we can all benefit economically, politically, and socially together? They said, I don't see how the US can win over China due to the US having less population, factories, government support for development.
Right. And the second question, I think interesting because it sort of attempts to answer itself by saying if the US cannot win, then shouldn't we get along and mutually benefit? And I think for many, many years, let's not forget that for 40 years, the US has engaged the People's Republic of China. Again, we've opened our markets, we've transferred our technology, we've transferred enormous amounts of capital, and really done, I think, exactly what we intended to do on the economic side, which was to integrate China into the global economy and have that as in a way as just a good that we provided without thinking about the consequences. But the other side of it, of course, was that the United States believed that political liberalization would follow. And I think at this point, it's pretty clear that hasn't happened. I think it's underestimated how genuinely clear Beijing's overall geopolitical objectives are, the nature of its intent, the fact that this is all so thoroughly documented and communicated that it's really a matter of evidence as opposed to conjecture at this point as to what Beijing is trying to achieve. So I think, it's not that they're looking for true coexistence. They're looking for something that is far different from that, which is geopolitical dominance in their region, and ultimately to set that as a foundation for a far broader role in the world. And this also is about totalitarian, authoritarian dictatorship that is carrying out a genocide. That's the official position of governments around the world now. It's been documented extensively by researchers, and that's built a military that is literally designed for combat with the United States in the Pacific. And they did all of this during our years of when engagement was not only a business strategy, but it was essentially a national strategy. We believed that through engagement, we would create a friend, a responsible stakeholder, and in even a pillar to global security. And we got the opposite. We empowered a vision of victory that I think is, one that Americans need to sort of get acquainted with and get into the action phase. And we're dealing with an adversary that is deeply into the action phase. We are still in the discussion phase. So I think the longer that we have this debate, and that's fine. There are plenty of people that I think, it matters for the country to sort of get acquainted with these issues and see them, but we also need to be acting now. I mean, it's time for us to realize, what's at stake and what we're dealing with. And the fact that we're not dealing with, this is not a Communist Party, Gorbachev, definitely not. It's not even a Khrushchev. This is something very different. It's a party that believes that they are ascendant, that they are able to win wars. We're talking about a lot of China's vision of victory, the party's discussion on a regular basis of being prepared to fight and win wars in their region. This is while we were engaging economically. So at this point, I think it's time for us to turn the page and to get into a contest where we are able to secure the sort of the US, the alliance system, our supply chains, our economic lead, our military deterrence. All of those are just basic forms of security. And if we really believe that there's an argument to be made for, the continued rise of China under the Communist Party of China, I think that's not really where we need to go. And let's not forget, this is about the party. For as long as the party is in power, for as long as it carries out the sorts of things it does and has the intentions that it clearly has, I think there's no reason for us to be providing the capital, technology, and economic access that enables them to achieve that vision. And all we have to do is stop doing the things that are ultimately harmful to us.
I think just for one little footnote, Jonathan, in the op-ed with the Wall Street Journal, I deal with the question of balance of power. You don't strive when you have potential adversaries in the world to have a balance of power.
That's right. That's right.
It's all about, trust me, they're not thinking about how they balance out our side. So we need to be looking where we change that balance, and it's a safer world if we do. If Russia is a less belligerent country and China's by itself, there's less chances of aggression, and there's an opportunity here. So I understand it's just one that I don't agree with, that we have to find a way to make sure that they feel comfortable that the power is balanced. And I think I come from a different school of thought over many years. So let me go back, Rachel.
That's right, because this book is about, it's not about accommodation, as Graham Allison talked about. It's not about engagement, as Henry Kissinger, I think, sadly misled us for many decades. This is about an old thing called preponderance, which is how do you, because I agree, I think the balance of power is dangerous. The balance of power is where you start to have adversaries that are risk takers, such as Putin, and men of enormous ambition, such as Xi Jinping, who are willing to probe at the, if things become even, this gets much more dangerous. But if we still have this moment where we can rebuild allied preponderance and US economic preponderance, we need to take it. If we let that go, and one point that I think is very important on the economic side is we have never faced a military adversary of of equal or greater economic power since the War of 1812. So if anyone would like to go back to that time, I think we should strenuously work against that. That is not.
Jonathan, in your book, there's a common theme in both books, actually, is that it's not just how do you weaken the other side, it's how do you strengthen ourselves. So right. Much of your book is the importance of self-reflection on our behavior, so that it's how do we grow in strength. So I don't want to go any further, but if people want to see and hear more about what you think in this, which I happen to agree on, they need to read that book. So Rachel?
Yeah, so we've had a few questions come in about India. So the first is, does China's Belt and Road Initiative affect India's economic engine?
Well, look, so the Belt and Road strategy fundamentally is about tying the continents of, the Eurasian, African, Indian Ocean, Australian supercontinental structure back to China, with China as the centerpiece of that global economy. So it's very focused on the global South, which I think is becoming a more known and popular phrase here, meaning the world's emerging nations. And it's also, I think, equally in a different way focused on the OECD and the advanced industrial democracy. And it basically seeks to create a world economy with China as the center. And they've already won, enormous portions of the game for global trade and goods. I mean, they've become the dominant trading partner of a plurality of nations in the world. And, and then the Belt and Road goes through the Indian Ocean as well as through Central Asia. So for India, and China's Vision of Victory talks a lot about the geopolitics of the Belt and Road, but for India to be essentially encircled through, an Indian Ocean initiative that is focused not only on Africa and the Middle East, but also on Indian Ocean island states. And I spent a lot of, a decent amount of time traveling through the Indian Ocean islands and seeing the Chinese state-owned enterprises that are building up the infrastructure, the Chinese banks that are backing that. And then, of course, the geopolitical relevance of all that, I think, is quite clear to those that work on the region. So for India, and back when China-India relations went through their rise and fall in the 50s and 60s, from Bandung to the border war in 1962, from proclaiming that they would share the world as brothers of 2,000 years, as Zhou Enlai and Nehru said, to then actually fighting a war in the Himalayas. There was this contest for leadership in the emerging world. And it was one where, that era's leaders of the Chinese Communist Party saw themselves as having to push India out of the way ultimately. So I think India is aware of this through their history. The big question for all of us is, which side will India choose? If India remains non-aligned, as is much of its diplomatic history, I think the free world will lack the necessary heft to take on this contest with Moscow and Beijing. Between the US and Europe, we have economic heft. With Japan and Australia and other allies in Asia, Philippines and South Korea, we have military depth and heft in the Pacific. But we need, I think, another economic major power, and that is India, and we need another military major power, and we need one that's on our side. So India has enormous and consequential choices to make in this decade. And I think their balancing act between Russia and the United States has been a feature of their diplomacy since Indian independence. But if India could choose sides, as opposed to striving for the the multipolar world, which I think actually presents far more dangers than it resolves, then I think the free world is going to be in very good shape. So we all should care a great deal about India's choices and outcomes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you just answered, the first part of this question, but I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on the second half. So the next question is, does India seem to be the emerging key factor in the shaping of the new geopolitical order and the key factor in which democracy or authoritarianism wins out in the near future?
Well, I think India is a very, let's call it a tier one factor. I mean, it's one of the most important factors. The way that I divided the diplomatic arena in the Decisive Decade is on what I think are important pillars of what a US strategy should look like. One, for the alliance system and the democracies involved therein. Two, for the emerging world. And three, the major powers. The major powers being India and Russia. I mean, those are major states that will tip the geopolitical balance, or at least substantially influence it, depending on where they line up here. So I think India is extremely important. And I also think there's another side to this, which is the other sort of emerging power, so to speak. I mean, a country like Indonesia, I think, is going to be incredibly important. That's a $1 trillion economy. It matters a great deal to the future of Southeast Asia and Asia as a whole, the Indo-Pacific, and its geography is incredibly important. I traveled very widely in Indonesia, including on Indonesian cargo ships, which is a story that Jack and I can get into sometime. But some have seen a lot of that country. I think that's incredibly important. I think states like Nigeria and Brazil are incredibly important. So there are going to be these large emerging world nations that I think we need to care about a lot. And I think the more that India works together with the sort of alliance of democracies, I mean, the better chance we're all going to have in the emerging world. So for instance, there's a India-Japan initiative in Africa about creating essentially infrastructure in Africa. I mean, that's something that is rarely talked about, I think, but very important as a template. Then there's back when I was more of an analyst of Indo-Pacific geopolitics, I remember always looking at the fact that India was training Vietnamese, sort of fighter pilots and submariners. I mean, these sorts of connections that fly beneath the radar show us the influence of that country. And again, I think that the point really would be for them to have a clear vision of where they'll wind up in world affairs and realize that China's rise in the Indo-Pacific, which includes their entire Himalayan border, and let's not forget the first instance of violence against another state was Chinese troops in the Himalayas, with brickbats essentially beating Indian soldiers to death during the COVID-19 pandemic. India knows which side it's on when it comes to the China situation, but I think in the broader global picture, there's a far larger role for them to play if they work with the United States.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. And the first, this audience member said, please discuss the Quad and other allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific.
Sure. So the quadrilateral security dialogue, it's a grouping that's fairly recent, last 5 years or so, of the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. It's in a way you could maybe say it emerged out of the fact that we used to have the Malabar naval exercises, and those eventually sort of a U.S.-India thing. It eventually became sort of also Japan and Australia would join, and we've had a lot of I think important security cooperation with these states in the Indo-Pacific, and then of course Shinzo Abe had his vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which I think has found its way across the diplomacy of the free world states of that region. And the Quad is a grouping that on one hand is security based, but I think it's also going to have an increasing economic role. I mean, there's been Quad discussion of supply chains, including medical supply chains during the COVID pandemic. I think it's sort of the perfect grouping in a way to create an economic counterpoint when it comes to supply chain security. I mean, Japanese sort of corporate governance structure, I think, is going to be incredibly interesting to strategic competition. The fact that their companies are, I think, a little tighter with their own national interests than ours often are. The Australian economy is a resource base. I mean, if we're going to do rare earths and critical minerals, it's going to be Australia and Canada, and to some degree the US. And then India as a potentially alternative manufacturing supply chain. I mean, there will be factories. I mean, you look at Apple already talking about moving supply chains into India and assembly into India. That will be very significant, I think. And then, of course, the United States as the world's largest economic power, and in many ways the necessary geopolitical bedrock for the 21st century contests. And then the other thing that I think matters about the Quad is once you have that group more active, Quad +1 type things will be very interesting. I mean, would Indonesia, for instance, be more interested in partnering with the Quad nations or with the People's Republic of China? I think there's, Indonesia fits into a Quad +1 pretty clearly. The Philippines, where we're really, I think, reviving our military alliance, which goes back to, I believe, 1951. I mean, it's going to be great to be able to offer that block of, emerging nations and also industrial, Japan, major industrial democracy in Asia. And then, it's global and yet it's regional. And it, I think, can be a very interesting economic, diplomatic, and military grouping. So very important move for us to, the fact that we all recognize that matters is very good.
So turning to Africa, why is the US not investing in African countries at the rate that China has?
Well, that's a great and very direct question. And I address this in the Decisive Decade. I have a whole section on Africa where, I recently learned that Huawei has over 10,000 sales representatives in Africa, and that 70% of Africa's 4G infrastructure has been built with Huawei components. So, take that as just one of, many pieces of how the economic relationship works between China and Africa. I think Africa, we're not there. I mean, we're not there, and this question is exactly right. We need to be in Africa. I mean, Africa is going to be, one of the most important pieces of the emerging world, and I think to get American companies and banks more interested in Africa. I mean, China's companies and banks are there, and by the way, I mean, this is one of the key elements: is their corporate strategies are entirely about going global. Often in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party's strategies, and certainly where economic opportunity exists, but they've found enormous opportunity in Africa, and I think we're overlooking it. And this is a part where a new U.S. economic strategy, which, for instance, makes far greater use of foreign commercial service officers, of the Development Finance Corporation, of an Exim Bank, of I've proposed a U.S. and allied sovereign wealth fund focused on the Indo-Pacific. And I think, the Indo-Pacific, let's face it, includes Africa. If you're talking about real Indian Ocean geography, that's Africa. and the Middle East. So we need an Africa strategy and we need an economic strategy. We need to present opportunity to the emerging nations. I think that's a good solid chunk of how we win the long game economically. And, you know, part of this is just, you know, I mean, Larry Summers, I think in you know, the past few weeks said something that I think is very memorable. Someone said to him, America gives us a lecture and China gives us an airport. And that is not going to work. I mean, we are going to have to get in the business of creating real economic opportunity, investment, and trade links with the world's emerging nations, and especially the ones that are strategically important as the whole of Africa. I mean, that's, you know, one of the world's greatest and most important continents. And, you know, Beijing understands that, and we are not yet there.
So if we could squeeze in just one more question to bring it back to the book here at the end, but what do you think is the most important strategic suggestion that you make in your book?
The number one thing, if I could have this book accomplish one thing, it would be for our business leaders, boardrooms, and for Wall Street to go through the same awakening on the geopolitical challenges presented by China that Washington, D.C. has. I think Washington, D.C. has woken up to this in a very significant way over the past 5 years. We need our business leaders to be involved in this. You can't win an economic competition without your major businesses. That's how we won the Second World War. It's how we maintained enormous advantages in the Cold War. But right now, we're not even close to having boardrooms, CEOs, and Wall Street banks on the right side of this competition. And without them, we lose. With them, I think we're going to do this just right. And I think you want this to be an economic and diplomatic competition where deterrence is maintained as opposed to a military conflict, which I think we all want to avoid. But in order to avoid that, you have to win a strategic competition that's based on economics and diplomacy. And we can't do that without CEOs and boardrooms. So I'd love to see them get involved. And let's get back to what Arthur Herman called, the basically, he identified how our businesses helped us win the Second World War. I mean, that evidence is all there, and we need them one more time.
Well, thank you both again so much. And I'll turn it back over to the two of you and Kim to wrap us up.
Thank you both. That was so fascinating, and your expertise and perspectives, I think, have entertained us all and made us more educated on all the complexities of those issues. So thank you both for your time and this expertise that we don't usually have that exposure to. This is wonderful.
Jonathan, it was great fun. And I thought you brought a lot to the table for people to think about. So proud to be supporting your book.
Well, thank you all so much. And thanks, Kim, for being the first, webinar stop on my book tour. And Jack, thank you for, all your years of friendship and everything we've done together. And, I think for those who are interested in the book, I'd love to have us all engaging with these issues. And I've presented both the challenge and the counterpoint. And, the more that is part of our national conversation, the better answers we'll reach and actions we'll take. So thank you all for your time.